Bonjour tout le monde. Every student that I've ever taught has struggled with one particular grammatical element. Ah. Considering it's only one letter long, this preposition causes so much confusion, and I wanted to make a video to address that. Now, because there are so many things to talk about, I have kindly separated this video into sections, so if there's just one thing that you want to learn about, you can click on it and you'll be transported to the relevant point in the video. If, on the other hand, you're starting from scratch, I don't recommend that you watch the video from start to finish. A, because you have a life to live, and B, because by the time you get to the end, you'll have forgotten everything you learnt at the start. Instead, I suggest that you watch a bit, learn a bit, and then come back when you're happy to move on. So, before this video does end up being 7,000 years long, let's begin with the very basics of A. On a basic level, A translates to one of three prepositions: to, at, or in, and it all depends on the context. For example, je suis à une fête. I am at a party. Or, je vais à une réunion. I am going to a meeting. Or, j'habite à Paris. I live in Paris. Now, as it happens, "à" only translates to "in" when we're talking about being in towns or cities. If you're talking about being in countries or boxes or debt, we'll use different words, but we're not bothered about that at the minute. All we need to know is that the basic translation of "à" is to, at, or in. Congratulations, you've passed the first hurdle. Let's move on to number 2. So continuing with our to, at, and in theme, what happens when we want to say to the, at the, or in the? Well, some changes have to take place. For example, if we want to say I am at the cinema, we can't just say je suis à le cinéma. That would be far too easy. Instead, à has to change. So when à is followed by le, it becomes au. So our sentence is je suis au cinéma. I am at the cinema. Or je vais au cinéma. I am going to the cinema. Thankfully, à and la don't change, so à la. Il est à la piscine. He is at the swimming pool. Nous allons à la plage. We are going to the beach. Likewise with a plus l apostrophe, nothing changes. Il travaille à l'église. He works at the church. Vous êtes à l'hôpital. You are at the hospital. A plus les does change though. It becomes au, aux. For example, je suis aux États-Unis. I am in the United States. Now I know I said that we don't use a when talking about being in countries, but the United States is one of those few countries that is plural and therefore requires au. Another example of that would be les Pays-Bas, the Netherlands. So we say je suis aux Pays-Bas, I'm in the Netherlands. That shouldn't be too difficult, but I should tell you that you will sometimes see à le or à les. For example, j'ai du mal à le faire, which means I'm having trouble doing it. Now the reason that we have à le instead of au is that in this sentence le does not mean the. Now I'm not going to explain the grammar, we simply don't have time. If you want to know about that, learn about direct object pronouns, for which I have a video somewhere in the depths, but for now, let's move on. Some verbs are always followed by a and then an infinitive. For example, commencer à faire quelque chose means to start to do something. For example, j'ai commencé à fumer. I have started to smoke, which, by the way, is not actually the case, it's just an example. Likewise, we could say encourager quelqu'un à faire quelque chose, to encourage somebody to do something. For example, il m'encourage à gagner. He's encouraging me to win. Also, we can say avoir du mal à faire quelque chose, to have trouble or difficulty doing something. Nous avions du mal à lire la lettre. We were having trouble reading the letter. Now it might feel like we're repeating ourselves a little bit with these examples. Il m'encourage à gagner. Well, gagner means to win and à means to, so essentially we're saying he's encouraging me to win. And yes, I suppose that's right, it is a bit like repetition in English. But the best thing to do is not to think of à as meaning to in this case, and just accept that some verbs are followed by à, whether we translate it in English or not. There are some verbs that are followed by a and then a noun, and sometimes these are nice, easy translations. For example, to say something to someone is dire quelque chose à quelqu'un. J'ai dit à ma mère que j'avais menti. I said to my mother that I had lied. That could also mean I told my mother that I had lied. In French, to say and to tell are the same thing. Also, to give something to someone is donner quelque chose à quelqu'un. J'ai donné le livre à mon frère. I gave the book to my brother, or of course, I gave my brother the book. Now these are nice, easy translations, they're literal, but sometimes we have verbs followed by a that don't translate literally. For example, jouer means to play, but if we're talking about playing a sport, we have to say jouer à plus the sport. For example, to play basketball is jouer au basket, because basketball is le basket, and as we should know by now, a plus le becomes au. So I play basketball is je joue au basket. This has no translation in English because we just say I play basketball. In French, for whatever reason, you have to say I play to basketball. But like with the verbs plus a plus infinitive, don't try to think of a as a word in this case. It's just something that has to be there that we can't really translate. A similar situation is with the verb obéir à quelqu'un, to obey someone. In English, you just obey someone. In French, essentially, you obey to them. For example, il obéit à son père. He obeys his father. Or j'obéis au prof. I obey the teacher. Again, this is something that we just have to accept and learn. And I think the best thing to do is to learn verbs that are followed by prepositions with their prepositions. So don't think of to give as donner, think of to give as donner à, and you should never forget. Indirect object pronouns link quite nicely with verbs followed by a and a noun because it's those verbs with which we use indirect object pronouns. Now I do have a video about this, you can learn all about them in my pronouns video, but we'll just go over it in this video because it does link in quite nicely. So the indirect object pronouns are me, to me, te, to you, lui, to him or to her, nous, to us, vous, to you, and leur, to them. So I told them is je leur ai dit. One of the examples in the a plus noun section was j'ai dit à ma mère que j'avais menti. I told my mother that I had lied. What if we wanted to say I told her that I had lied? Well, because we've got a verb plus a, we need an indirect object pronoun. And to her is lui. So we'll say je lui ai dit que j'avais menti. I told her that I had lied, or I said to her that I had lied. Another example might be je vous ai donné les réponses. I gave to you the answers. I gave you the answers. To telephone someone is téléphoner à quelqu'un. So I telephoned him or I telephoned her is je lui ai téléphoné. I've made a video about e in the past, and if you want a more detailed explanation of its use, then you should watch my e and on video. I am going to go through it a little bit in this video though, because it is related to a, and it is in fact essentially just another indirect object pronoun, but instead of talking about people, to you, to me, it means to it. So for example, we know that je joue au basket means I'm playing basketball. But what if you just want to say I am playing it? Well, a lot of people would be tempted to say je le joue because they know that je le fais is I do it. But we know that when we're talking about playing a sport, we need that a in some form or another. We have to acknowledge the fact that when we're talking about playing a sport, jouer is followed by a. So le will not do. We can't use the other indirect object pronouns because they're all too personal. They're talking about people. So we just use I in exactly the same way. So I play it, talking about a sport we've already mentioned, is j'y joue. Likewise, to think about something is penser à quelque chose. So, I'm thinking about my life is je pense à ma vie. But if we wanted to just say I'm thinking about it, we wouldn't say je le pense because that's just I think it. What we need to say is j'y pense. E can also mean there, and if you think about it, it's quite logical. We know that to go to a place is aller à plus a place, like we saw with je vais au cinéma. To say I go there, we're not going to say je le vais because that's I go it. What we essentially want to say is I go to it, or as we would in English, I go there. So we acknowledge the fact that a exists and we say j'y vais. Now we have the dreaded auquel, laquelle, auquel, and auquel, all of which are just relative pronouns. Of course, if you want to know more about relative pronouns, you can watch the appropriate video. But all these are relative pronouns with prepositions. Qui and que are fine when we don't have prepositions, but throw an a or a de or an avec or a dans in there and we have to move things around a little bit. Let's say, for example, we want to say the building that I'm thinking about. We know that to think about something is penser à quelque chose. So a lot of people automatically say le bâtiment que je pense à because they think, well, that is que, and the about bit is our a, so I put that at the end. But in French, you cannot end a sentence with a preposition, which is why we have to move things around a little bit. And it's in this case that we're going to use auquel, à laquelle, auquel, or auquel, which of course agrees with whatever it is that it's talking about. So instead, the building that I'm thinking about is actually the building about which I am thinking. Le bâtiment auquel je pense. Let's also have a look at the thing that I'm thinking about. The thing is la chose. So instead of saying auquel, we'll say à laquelle. La chose à laquelle je pense. Another example would be to face something is faire face à quelque chose. So if we say the situation that I face, or literally the situation to which I face, la situation à laquelle je fais face. One other thing I should mention about these is that they're used very much for objects and they're a little bit too impersonal to talk about people. For example, if you're saying to speak to someone, which is parler à quelqu'un, it's a little bit strange to say la personne à laquelle je parle. À laquelle is such a sort of objecty type word, so instead we can just say à qui, to whom, la personne à qui je parle. It's not entirely wrong to use à laquelle, but à qui is much more personal. Now we just have some fiddly little situations to handle. For example, penser à, which we know means to think about, is a bit of a strange one. We can quite happily use I when we're talking about thinking about things. J'y pense, I'm thinking about it. And if you say to someone, well, how do you say I'm thinking about her? They think, well, I've got an a in penser à, so I need an indirect object pronoun. To her is lui, therefore je lui pense. And logically, that is perfect. But we don't say that in French. Instead, we say je pense à elle, je pense à lui, je pense à toi, je pense à vous. We use à followed by the emphatic pronoun. Now, to tell you the absolute truth, I'm not entirely sure why this is, but if it helps, just remember, penser à plus a person will not use the indirect object pronoun. Then there are questions. Sometimes you want to say, what are you thinking about? You can't say, qu'est-ce que tu penses à, remember, because we can't end a sentence with a preposition. Instead, you'd have to say, à quoi penses tu? About what are you thinking? Likewise, if you're talking about a person, à qui parles-tu? To whom are you speaking? So we start the question with the preposition rather than ending it with the preposition. Quite often you'll hear people say, oh, c'est à moi, it's to me, which in English doesn't make any sense. Être à quelqu'un indicates possession. So for example, I could say, cette carte-là est à moi. That card is mine, okay? À moi is mine. You could equally say, cette carte-là est la mienne, which does literally translate to mine. But you can also use this a plus person structure. It's more useful when you want to say something like, the ring is my mother's. You don't want to have to say, the ring is my mother's ring, which in French is la bague est la bague de ma mère, because it's too much repetition. So you can simply say, la bague est à ma mère. And that, my friends, is about it for the preposition à. I know there is a lot, and you may have to watch this video a few times for it all to sink in. But of course, if you're having any problems, or if you even think there's something that I've missed, do let me know, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. You can get into some really sticky situations with this word. It's just so small and so annoying sometimes. So let me know if you're having any difficulties. Until next time, a bientôt.